Hey guys, tonight we're climbing all the way down, past the marble staircases and the potted palms and the men in dinner jackets arguing about cigars, down to the bottom of the most famous ship that ever sank. Down where the air smells like fresh paint and old socks. Down where the rich never went, and where frankly they didn't want to know you existed. Before we cast off, if this channel helps you drift off, gently tap that like button and subscribe. But only if you actually enjoy what I do here. No pressure. I'll still be here either way, talking softly into the dark about people who have been dead for over a century. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. It's definitely 2 a.m. somewhere, and I find it strangely comforting to imagine all of us, scattered across the world, lying in the dark together, refusing to sleep responsibly. Now, dim those lights. Switch on a fan for that gentle white background noise. Pull the blanket up to your chin. Get comfortable because this is going to be a long voyage, and the good news is that you do not have to survive it. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be poor in 1912? Not poor in the modern sense, where being poor still involves a phone and a roof, and the occasional disappointing sandwich. Poor in the old way, the genuine, bone-deep, sold the cow to pay for the ticket way. Have you ever wondered where the poorest passengers on the Titanic slept, and what they ate, and whether they ever once laid eyes on the famous parts of the ship you've seen in the films? Have you ever wondered who they were and where they were going, and why on earth they thought a giant metal box on the freezing Atlantic was a step up in life? Well, tonight you're going to find out, because tonight you are one of them. Congratulations. You've just woken up in the spring of 1912, in a damp boarding house near the docks of Southampton, England. You own almost nothing. You have a battered case, a few coins sewn into the lining of your coat, and a steerage ticket for a ship called the Titanic, which everyone keeps telling you is the grandest thing ever built. You're about to cross an ocean to start a new life in America, and you have no idea, none whatsoever, that history is going to remember the next 5 days for the rest of time. So let's see what life was really like for the dirt poor on the Titanic. Settle in. We have all night, and the ship doesn't sail until morning. It looks enormous. That's the first thing. You've heard the word unsinkable thrown around so often that you half expected the ship to glow or hum or part the clouds. Instead, it simply sits there at the quayside, 4 enormous funnels reaching up into a grey English sky, and it is so large that your brain quietly refuses to process it as a single object. You arrive at the docks early because you are poor, and poor people are always early. Lateness is a luxury for people who can afford to miss things. You've been awake since before dawn, partly out of nerves, partly because the boarding house mattress had the structural integrity of a wet newspaper. The dock is a churning mass of humanity. Families clutching crying children. Old women sitting on bundles as if guarding the last warm thing on earth. Young men with the specific swagger of people who have never been more frightened in their lives. Everyone is carrying everything they own, and for most of these people, everything they own fits in one bag with room to spare. You'll notice the clothes. The first-class passengers, gliding past in motorcars, wear the kind of coats that cost more than your father earned in a decade. You, by contrast, are wearing all of your warmest clothing at once, not because it's cold, but because it's easier than packing it. You look less like a traveller and more like a confused onion. There are porters shouting, there are gulls screaming, which is the gull's only real talent. There is the smell of coal smoke and salt water, and frying food from somewhere you cannot afford, and over all of it, towering, is the ship, and a small but insistent voice in your head says the same thing it has been saying for weeks. You sold the cow for this. You better not drown. Your fellow steerage passengers come from everywhere. There are Irish families fleeing a country that has run out of room and hope in roughly equal measure. There are Swedes and Norwegians and Finns, blonde and quiet and built like furniture. There are Lebanese travellers who have already crossed half the world to get to this dock. Everyone is going to the same place, America, that magical word, said with the particular reverence usually reserved for heaven or for a really good harvest. You shuffle forward in the line. Somewhere far above you, in a world you will never see, Someone is being shown to a suite with a private promenade. You're being shown to a queue, and the queue, like all queues in history, moves at the speed of pure misery. Let's talk about the ticket, because the ticket is the whole reason you're standing here in 7 layers of clothing. A third-class ticket on the Titanic cost somewhere in the region of £7 or £8, depending on where you boarded and how far you were going. Now, £7 does not sound like much. Today it would buy you roughly one disappointing airport sandwich and a bottle of water. But in 1912, for a labouring family, £7 was a catastrophe with a number attached. To find that money, you did the things poor people have always done. You sold the cow, if you had a cow. You sold the furniture, the good furniture, the furniture your mother was given when she married. You took up a collection from relatives who could barely afford to lend it, and who will be quietly judging your success in America for the rest of their lives. You worked extra. You went without. You did the maths over and over at the kitchen table, by candlelight, because candles are cheaper than lamp oil and you are nothing if not committed to the theme. And here is the part that history finds genuinely touching, in between all the bits where everyone drowns. People did this on purpose. They chose the Titanic. Not because it was glamorous, although the posters certainly tried, but because White Star Line had a reputation for treating steerage passengers with something approaching basic dignity. On many ships of the era, third class meant being herded into a single open dormitory in the bowels of the vessel, where you slept in rows like cargo that occasionally coughed. The Titanic, by the standards of the day, was practically generous. You'd been told there were proper cabins, beds with actual mattresses, food included served at a table, by people whose job it was to bring it to you. To a family that has eaten potatoes for 3 meals a day for a year, food included brought to you is not a detail. It is a dream bordering on the indecent. So you scrape together the impossible sum, and you bought the ticket, and you have it now in an inside pocket, checked roughly every 90 seconds to confirm it has not evaporated. It is a small rectangle of card, and it represents your savings, your hope, your gamble, and your entire family's future, all printed in ink that smudges if you touch it too much, which is why you keep touching it. You'd been promised the trip of a lifetime. You would in the end get exactly that, just not in the way the poster suggested. Before they let you anywhere near the gangway, there is the small matter of being inspected like a slightly suspicious piece of fruit. Here is something the films tend to leave out. The entire architecture of third class on the Titanic, every gate, every barrier, every locked corridor that will later become so grimly important, was not built purely out of snobbery, although there was plenty of that to go around. It was built because of America. The United States in 1912 had opinions about who it let in. Strong opinions. Steerage passengers, the poor, the foreign, the desperate, were exactly the people America wanted to inspect very carefully before allowing them to start mailing letters home about how wonderful everything was. At Ellis Island, third-class arrivals would be poked, prodded, questioned, and examined for any sign of disease, madness, or insufficient funds. If you failed, you were sent back across the ocean you had just spent everything to cross. So the inspections began before you even boarded. A doctor, or a man dressed convincingly as one, peers at your eyes, looking for trachoma, a contagious infection that could get your whole family turned around at the far end. He checks your scalp. He looks at your hands. He asks you questions designed to confirm that you're not visibly insane, which, given that you have just sold your cow to sail on a metal building, is a higher bar than it sounds. You stand very straight. You smile in a way you hope reads as sane and healthy, rather than terrified and slightly feverish. You have heard the stories of families separated at the gangway, the husband waved through, the wife held back because of a cough, and you would very much like to not be a story. The whole process has the warmth and intimacy of a livestock auction. You're a number now, a manifest entry, a unit of hopeful poverty being processed by an empire that views you as a potential problem to be managed. And the maddening thing is, you understand it. You'd probably do the same. Nobody wants to import someone else's tuberculosis. You pass. Of course you pass. Well, this would be a very short and depressing voyage. Your card is stamped or marked or simply nodded at by a tired official who has seen 10,000 faces today and will see 10,000 more. And with that small bureaucratic blessing, you are finally, officially, allowed to climb aboard the largest moving object human beings have ever made. You take a breath, you grip your bag, you step onto the gangway, and somewhere above you, a band is playing, though obviously not for you. You step inside, and the ship swallows you. Now, the first thing you need to understand about being poor on the Titanic is geography. The ship is a layer cake of human worth. The higher you are, the closer to the sky and the lifeboats and the fresh air, the more you matter. The lower you are, the closer to the engines and the waterline and the rats, the less anyone upstairs has thought about you at all. You, my friend, are going down. You descend and descend. Past landings, through corridors, down stairwells painted in cheerful white enamel that still smells of the factory. The deeper you go, the warmer it gets, because you're heading toward the great roaring heart of the ship, the boilers, where men you will never meet are about to shovel coal into furnaces for the next 5 days as if auditioning for the afterlife. Single men are sent forward toward the bow. Families and single women are sent aft toward the stern. This is for the sake of decency, which in 1912 is a force roughly as powerful as gravity. The idea of unmarried men and unmarried women sleeping in the same general region of a ship was, to the planners, only marginally less alarming than the iceberg turned out to be. You find your cabin, and here is where you brace yourself for a horror and instead get a pleasant surprise. It's small, yes, cramped, certainly. But it is a real room, with real bunks, 2 or 4 or 6 of them, stacked with the efficiency of people who understand that space is money. There are mattresses, there is a little wash basin, there are hooks for your coat, and a mirror barely large enough to confirm that yes, you still look exhausted. For you, this is luxury. You have shared beds with siblings, with cousins, with the occasional farm animal during a hard winter. A bunk of your own, with a mattress that is yours alone for 5 whole nights, is the single most extravagant thing that has ever happened to you. You sit on it, you bounce slightly, testing. You try not to grin like an idiot, and you fail. The bunk is narrow, the kind of narrow where rolling over is a decision rather than a reflex. The blanket is rough, white starline wool stamped with the company name, presumably so you don't try to smuggle a blanket into America and bring down the whole shipping industry. The pillow is thin, but it is dry and it is warm, and nobody is going to ask you to milk it at 5 in the morning. You stow your bag, you claim your space, and for one quiet moment, before the great adventure truly begins, you lie back on your own narrow bunk in the belly of the unsinkable ship, and you think, with the genuine joy of a person who has known real hardship, well, this is rather nice. It is, for now. Let's meet the people you'll be sleeping near for the next 5 nights, because in steerage, you do not get to choose your company, and your company does not get to choose you. You're flung together by fate, poverty, and a shipping company's seating algorithm. There's the older woman in the corner bunk who has clearly done this before, or done something like it, and who radiates the calm of a person who has stopped being surprised by anything. She has a way of looking at the younger passengers that says she has already calculated which of them will cry first. She's usually right. There's the young Irishman who cannot stop talking, because talking is what he does, instead of admitting that he is frightened. He has a brother in Boston, or a cousin in New York, or a vague relation somewhere in a country he has never seen, who has promised him work, lodging, and a future. He says the word America, the way other men say the name of a girl they're in love with. There's the family with too many children and not enough patience. The mother counting heads with the relentless instinct of someone who knows that losing a child in a ship this size is a genuine possibility. The children, of course, are delighted. To a child, the Titanic is not a desperate gamble across a freezing ocean, It is the largest and most exciting playground ever constructed, and they intend to test every inch of it, ideally at speed. And there's the quiet one, the passenger who speaks a language none of you share, who nods politely and keeps to himself and whose entire story you will never know. He might be Bulgarian, he might be Syrian, he might be Croatian or Finnish, or from some village whose name you couldn't pronounce if your life depended on it. You communicate through gestures, through shared bread, through the universal language of two strangers raising their eyebrows at the same screaming child. This is the thing about steerage that the grand films never quite capture. It is loud. It is crowded. It is a churn of accents and smells and snoring, and the cries of infants at 3 a.m. But it is also, in its way, alive. These are not the muffled, carpeted silences of first class, where everyone pretends not to notice each other. Down here, everyone notices everyone. You have to. You're breathing the same air, and there isn't much of it. By the second day, you will know these people. By the third, you will have opinions about them, strong ones, the kind of opinions you can only form about someone whose snoring you have memorised. The talkative Irishman will have driven you slightly mad. The calm older woman will have become a kind of anchor. The children will have either charmed you or made you reconsider your entire stance on children. This is your village now. A floating, temporary, accidental village, 4 decks below the wealthy, rolling slowly across the top of an ocean that does not care about any of you. And like every village in history, it will gossip, it will squabble, it will share its bread, and it will, when the worst possible moment comes, surprise you with its kindness and its cruelty in roughly equal measure. For now, though, it just snores, loudly. Get used to it. Now we come to a detail so perfectly, absurdly grim that it has become the single most famous fact about third class on the Titanic. The bathtubs. Specifically the number of them. There were two bathtubs. For somewhere in the region of 700 steerage passengers, one designated for men, one for women, in the great democratic spirit of making absolutely everyone wait. Let that arithmetic settle over you in the dark. 700 people, 2 tubs. If every single passenger wanted one bath during the entire voyage, and they politely took turns around the clock with no sleeping and no arguing, you would still be looking at a logistical nightmare that would make a modern festival toilet queue weep with recognition. The result, as you might imagine, is that nobody bathes. Or rather, almost nobody. The bath becomes a thing of legend, a rumour, a prize. You hear that someone somewhere managed to get into the tub on the first evening, and you regard this person with the awe usually reserved for explorers and saints. For the rest of you, personal hygiene becomes a creative endeavour involving the little wash basin in your cabin, a flannel, and a profound spirit of optimism. Here is the part that will comfort you, lying there clean and warm in your modern bed. You do not care, not really, because you have never lived in a world of daily bathing. The idea of immersing your entire body in hot water every single day would strike you, a labourer of 1912, as the behaviour of either royalty or the dangerously eccentric. Back home, a proper bath was a weekly event at most, often a shared one, with the water getting progressively less appealing as the family worked its way through in order of importance. By those standards, 2 tubs and a wash basin is not deprivation. It's a spa. The wealthy, 4 decks above you, have a different relationship with water entirely. The grandest suites have private bathrooms. There is a heated swimming pool, an actual swimming pool on a ship, which to your mind is a concept bordering on witchcraft. There is a Turkish bath, all gleaming tiles and brass and steam, where rich people pay to sweat on purpose, which is something your ancestors would have found genuinely confusing, having spent their entire lives trying to sweat less. But you don't know about any of that, and it's just as well, because there is nothing more exhausting than envying a comfort you've never experienced. You have your wash basin, you have your flannel, you have your dignity more or less, and a faint but persistent smell that everyone around you also has, which means, in the strange mathematics of close quarters, that nobody can smell it at all. 2 bathtubs, 700 people, and somehow, remarkably, everyone simply gets on with it. Because that is what poor people have always done. They get on with it. While we're on the subject of 700 unwashed optimists in an enclosed space, let's address the air. Or more accurately, the lack of anything you could reasonably call fresh air. Steerage has a smell. It is not one smell, but a committee of smells, each contributing its own special note to a bouquet that you will be marinating in for the next 5 days. There is the fresh paint, because the ship is brand new and still off-gassing like a recently opened tin. There is coal smoke drifting from the great furnaces below. There is the sea itself, salt and iron and cold. And then there are the human contributions, which we will describe gently, in the dark, so as not to alarm anyone. There is the smell of cooking drifting up from the third-class galley, which is genuinely pleasant when it's roast beef, and considerably less so when it's anything involving boiled cabbage, a vegetable that has ended more friendships than money. There is the smell of seasickness, which arrives on the second day and never fully leaves. There is the smell of damp wool, of bodies, of babies, of 700 people quietly living their lives in a space designed by men who themselves would never sleep there. The ventilation does its best. Great trunking carries air down from above, pushed by fans, in a system that the engineers were rather proud of. And in fairness, it works. The air moves. It is not the stagnant, lethal thug of the older immigrant ships, where steerage passengers sometimes arrived in America genuinely ill from the journey itself. The Titanic, again, is trying. It is the most luxurious budget accommodation the world has ever seen. But moving air is not the same as fresh air, and you will spend the voyage in a permanent low-grade awareness of the atmosphere. You will find yourself drawn, again and again, to the open deck spaces, to that small allotment of sky the company has grudgingly provided for people like you, simply to fill your lungs with something that hasn't already been breathed by 100 other people first. The wealthy, of course, have promenades, long, glorious, glass-enclosed promenades where they can stroll in the sea air without the indignity of wind in their hair. Some suites have private promenades, private slices of ocean view, so that a rich man need never share his horizon with anyone he hasn't been formally introduced to. You have the well deck, a patch of open steel at the front of the ship exposed to the elements, where the cargo cranes loom and the spray comes over the bow when the sea gets up. It is not glamorous, it is freezing, but it is yours, and on that first evening, as the lights of England slip away behind you, you stand at the rail and breathe, properly breathe, and the cold air tastes like the future. It also tastes faintly of coal. But you've decided not to mention that. Now, food, glorious, included, brought to you food. This, for you, is where the Titanic stops being a ship and starts being a small miracle. You're summoned to the third-class dining saloon, and it is, by your standards, magnificent. It's not the soaring first-class restaurant with its crystal and its orchestra, obviously, but it is clean, it is bright, painted in cheerful enamel white, with long tables and sturdy swivel chairs bolted to the floor so they don't go sliding across the room when the sea misbehaves. There are portholes, there is actual daylight, there are staff in uniform whose entire job is to feed you. Read that again, slowly, with the brain of a person who has spent their life on the edge of hunger. There are people here whose job is to feed you, not your mother, exhausted after a day's work, not yourself, scraping together whatever the garden produced. Strangers, paid strangers, bringing you food, on plates, that they then take away and wash. You sit down at the long table among your fellow travellers. There's a steward who calls you to meals with a handbell, ringing it through the corridors like the world's most welcome alarm. You file in at the appointed hour because in steerage meals happen on a schedule and the schedule is sacred. Miss it and you wait for the next one, and the next one is hours away, and hunger has excellent timekeeping. The portions are generous. This is the part that genuinely astonishes the steerage passengers, the part they write home about. the part that survivors would later describe with a kind of wonder. There is enough. There is in fact more than enough. You can eat until you are full, an experience so novel that some passengers reportedly overdid it and made themselves ill, which is a deeply human way to respond to abundance after a lifetime of scarcity. The dining saloon runs in sittings because there are too many of you to feed at once, and the staff move through it all with brisk efficiency. There is a hum of conversation in a dozen languages. There is the clatter of cutlery, the scrape of chairs, the cry of a child who has decided that mealtimes are an excellent stage for a tantrum. It is loud and warm and full, and after a lifetime of thin soup and silence, it feels like a festival that happens 3 times a day. You eat properly, in company, at a table, indoors, warm, with no thought of where the next meal is coming from because you already know. It's coming in a few hours when the bell rings again. And if you're the sort of person who has ever lain awake at night doing sums about food, you will understand why so many of the poorest passengers on the Titanic later remembered the dining saloon not as a detail of the journey, but as one of the best parts of their entire lives. A terrible thing is coming, but the food, while it lasts, is wonderful. Let's open the menu, because you have never in your life been handed a menu, and the fact that one exists at all makes you feel briefly like an aristocrat who has fallen on interesting times. Breakfast on the Titanic in 3rd class is not the meagre crust you might expect. There is oatmeal porridge, hot and filling. There is smoked herring, fried bright and salty. There are eggs. There is bread, plenty of it, with butter and marmalade, and that word, marmalade, lands in your imagination like a small golden bell, because marmalade is the kind of thing other people have. There is coffee, or tea, in quantities that would have been unthinkable at home, where every leaf was used twice and then resentfully a 3rd time. Dinner, the main meal, served in the middle of the day in the proper old style, is the showstopper. Soup to begin, then roast beef, or boiled mutton, or some honest, heavy, glorious slab of actual meat, the kind your family ate on Christmas if you were lucky, and on no other day at all. Potatoes, of course, because it would not be a meal in 1912 without potatoes pulling their weight. Sweet corn, perhaps, an exotic touch. And then pudding, plum pudding, rice pudding. Something sweet and warm and entirely unnecessary, which is exactly what makes it so wonderful. Supper or tea in the evening is lighter, but still more than you're used to. Bread and cheese, cold meats, stewed fruit, biscuits, gruel for the children, and more tea, always more tea. The entire British Empire apparently running on the stuff. Now it is worth being honest about something. Lying here in the dark with a clear conscience, this food is good for steerage. It is not good in the way the 11-course first-class dinner is good, with its oysters and its filet mignon and its pâté and its endless parade of wines you couldn't name. Up there, the wealthier eating things you have never heard of, served on china you couldn't afford to break. The contrast, if you could see it, would be staggering, but you cannot see it, and so you do not measure your dinner against theirs. You measure it against home, against the long lean winters, against the meals that were mostly hope and hot water, and by that measure, by the only measure that matters to you, the food on the Titanic is a triumph. You go to bed full. Your children go to bed full. For 5 days, the oldest and most grinding fear of your life, the fear of an empty plate, simply lifts. It is, you think, almost worth the price of the ticket on its own. You have no way of knowing that for many of the people eating beside you, these will be among the last meals they ever eat. So eat. Enjoy it. There's plum pudding tonight, and the bell will ring again in the morning. When you're not eating, and you're not sleeping, and the deck is too cold even for your stubborn lungs, you go to the general room. This is the 3rd-class equivalent of a sitting room, a lounge, a parlour, and it is where the soul of steerage actually lives. Picture it. A large open space, again in that cheerful White Star enamel white. lined with wooden benches and chairs that have been bolted down by people who understand exactly what the sea does to unbolted furniture. The light comes in grey and gentle from the portholes. There is a faint, permanent rumble from the engine, so constant that within a day you stop hearing it, the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat. This is where the village gathers. The old women sit and knit and judge. The men play cards, slapping them down with the theatrical violence of people for whom a card game is the most important event of the day. Somebody always has a deck. Somebody always loses money they cannot afford to lose, and somebody always wins it. And the next day the whole thing repeats, the small economy of steerage circling endlessly like the gulls outside. Children tear through the room at a dead run, weaving between the benches, shrieking with a joy so pure it makes the adults smile despite themselves. There is no school here, no chores, no fields to work, nothing for a child to do but be a child at full volume in the largest indoor space they have ever seen. For these few days, the poorest children in the world are on the holiday of their lives. There are conversations in a dozen tongues. An Irish woman and a Swedish woman, sharing no common language, conduct an entire warm friendship through gestures, shared sweets, and the mutual rolling of eyes at their husbands. A group of young men teach each other rude words in their respective languages, which is, historically, one of the very first things any group of young men does, in any era, the moment they are thrown together. Someone has a fiddle. Someone always has a fiddle. And in the corner there is a piano, an actual upright piano provided by the company, because White Star understood that nothing keeps 700 restless people from turning on each other quite like music. This is the room where, in the evenings, the dancing will start. This is the room where strangers become something like friends. This is the room where, for a little while each day, the crushing weight of the journey, the fear of the unknown country ahead, the money spent and the bridges burned, all of it lifts, and steerage becomes not a holding pen for the poor, but simply a great crowded gathering of human beings, alive, together, rolling west towards something better. You find a bench, you watch the room, and you think, not for the last time, that you've never in your life been around so many people, and never felt so strangely at home. Let's go up for air, literally. Because for all the warmth of the general room and the wonder of the dining saloon, you're still a creature that needs the sky, and the ship has given you precisely one place to find it. The open deck space for third class is at the ends of the ship, the bow and the stern, the bits left over after the wealthy claimed the long sweeping middle promenades for themselves. You get the well deck forward, a sunken stretch of open steel between the raised forecastle and the bridge, and the poop deck aft, right at the very back, where the ship's wake churns out behind you in a long white road across the sea. It is not comfortable. Let's be clear about that. There is no glass enclosure, no shelter from the wind that comes howling across the North Atlantic with nothing to slow it down for 3,000 miles. There are no deck chairs with attendants bringing you broth the way there are upstairs. There are coiled ropes and cargo hatches and the great looming arms of the cranes, and a lot of cold, wet steel. But oh, the space. After the close, crowded, breathed-over air below, the open deck is a kind of glory. You climb the steel stairs, you push through the door, and the wind hits you like a slap and a blessing at the same time. The sky is enormous. The sea is everywhere, grey and green and endless, heaving slowly all the way to a horizon that never gets any closer. The young men gather here to look tough and feel the spray. The children, bundled against the cold by frantic mothers, run in circles until they are exhausted, which is the entire point. Couples find quiet corners. Old men stand at the rail for hours saying nothing, watching the country of their birth fall away behind the wake, and you do not ask them what they are thinking, because you already know. There is a strange democracy to the open deck. The sea does not care that you are poor. The wind does not check your ticket. For these few minutes standing at the rail with the spray on your face, you are simply a person on a ship in the middle of the ocean, the same as any millionaire 4 decks up. And the view, the actual view, the grey rolling immensity of the Atlantic is exactly the same for all of you. You'll come up here every day. You'll come up to breathe, to think, to escape the snoring and the cabbage and the crying. And on the 5th night, the last night, the open deck will be the coldest it has ever been. So cold that you'll wonder how the sea itself doesn't freeze. But that's the 5th night. Tonight, the wind is just wind, and the cold is just cold, and you stand at the rail of the greatest ship in the world and feel, despite everything, like the luckiest poor person who ever lived. Let's talk about the languages, because the third-class section of the Titanic was, without exaggeration, one of the most linguistically chaotic places on the planet for those 5 days. Upstairs, in first class, more or less everyone speaks English, or French, or the universal language of the very rich, which is mostly just confident silence and the occasional comment about somebody else's regrettable choices. Down here it is bedlam. Beautiful, baffling bedlam. There is English, in a dozen accents that can barely understand each other, the soft Irish and the broad Scandinavian inflected attempts, and the clipped English of the few English poor aboard. There is Swedish and Norwegian and Finnish, the great northern languages, spoken by the enormous contingent of Scandinavian emigrants heading for the farmlands of the American Midwest. There is Arabic, spoken by the Lebanese and Syrian travellers who have already come further than almost anyone. There is Bulgarian, Croatian, Armenian, Yiddish, French, and several languages that nobody around you can even identify. The result is a constant, cheerful struggle to be understood. Conversations are conducted at half speed, in fragments, helped along by pointing, miming, drawing in the air, and the slow, loud repetition that humans always reach for when volume feels like it should help, even though it never does. A man wants to know the time. He cannot ask in any language you speak. So he taps his wrist, raises his eyebrows, and you both look at the clock together and nod, and a tiny bridge has been built across an ocean of mutual incomprehension. The crew, for their part, do their best. Some of the stewards speak a few words of this language or that. There are interpreters, of a sort, but for the most part, communication in steerage runs on goodwill, gesture, and the shared understanding that everyone here is in the same boat, which on this particular occasion is not a metaphor. This will matter later. It will matter terribly. When the worst happens, the instructions that come down, when they come at all, will come in English, shouted into corridors full of people who do not speak it, in the dark, in a rising panic. A warning means nothing if you cannot understand the words. A direction to safety is just noise if it's in a tongue you've never heard. Some of the people around you tonight, sharing their bread and laughing at the same crying baby, will die in part because nobody told them where to go in a language they knew. But that is the 5th night, and we are not there yet. Tonight the Tower of Babel is a happy one. Tonight a Finnish grandmother and an Irish boy are teaching each other to count to 10, badly, delightedly, while the ship rolls west and the engines hum their endless lullaby. And for now, miraculously, everyone understands the only thing that matters, which is that they are not alone. It usually arrives on the 2nd day. The sea, which started out smooth and almost apologetic, begins to remember its true nature, and the great ship begins, ever so gently, to roll. And one by one, all across steerage, faces begin to go a delicate shade of green. Seasickness is the great equalizer of the lower decks. It does not care how brave you felt at the dock. It does not care about your dreams of America. It arrives, uninvited, and it turns the strongest young man into a trembling wreck draped over a railing, making peace with his God and his breakfast in roughly that order. The thing about being low in the ship, near the waterline, is that you actually feel the motion less than the passengers up high, where the roll is exaggerated by all that height. This is the one and only structural advantage of being poor on the Titanic, and your body, busy being miserable, is in no mood to appreciate it. The motion is still there. The slow, relentless, stomach-defying rise and fall, the floor coming up to meet you and then dropping away, over and over, for hours, for days. The cabins become unpleasant places. The dining saloon, so glorious yesterday, empties out because the sight and smell of food has become an act of open hostility. The corridors acquire a certain hazard, and the 2 bathtubs, already legendary, become even more theoretical as everyone's relationship with water turns complicated. There are remedies, of a sort. Fresh air, which is why the cold open decks fill with green-faced sufferers, gripping the rail and gulping the wind. Dry biscuits, nibbled with the desperate hope of a person trying to keep something, anything, on the inside, lying perfectly still and staring at a fixed point and bargaining with the universe. Old sailors will tell you the only true cure is to sit under a tree, which is a sailor's idea of a joke and not a bad one. The children, infuriatingly, often seem least affected, bouncing around the general room while their parents lie groaning in their bunks, wishing for a swift and merciful end. There is no justice in seasickness. There is only endurance, and the slow, grudging adjustment of the inner ear, which, given a day or two, eventually decides that yes, fine, this is the world now. The floor moves. We live on a moving floor. This is acceptable. And then, just as mysteriously as it came, it passes. By the 3rd or 4th day, most of steerage has found its sea legs. The green faces pink up again. The dining saloon fills back out. Appetites return with a vengeance, and the plum pudding is suddenly, urgently, the most important thing in the world again. You survive it. Of course you survive it. Seasickness, for all its melodrama, has never actually killed anyone, which is more than can be said for several other things this particular ship will encounter. But you don't know that yet. Tonight you just know that the floor will not stop moving, and that you would, in this exact moment, trade your ticket to America for 1 solid hour on dry, stationary, gloriously boring land. The children danced because the floor was moving and the music was loud, and there was simply no reason on earth not to. It was hot and crowded and loud, and the air filled with the smell of bodies and the sound of laughter, and for an hour or 2 each evening every single worry that had driven these people onto this ship simply ceased to exist. There was no America ahead, full of inspectors and uncertainty. There was no home behind, sold and lost and grieved. There was only this room, this music, this moment, and the simple, defiant, magnificent fact of being alive and together and on your way. This is the steerage the survivors remembered most fondly. Not the bunks, not the bathtubs, not even the wonderful food, the nights of music, the dancing, the strangers from a dozen countries finding in melody and rhythm the common language that words could never give them. There is a story, perhaps true, perhaps polished by time, that the music in steerage was still going strong late into the 5th night, that the dancing carried on right up until the moment the world changed. Whether or not it is precisely true, it ought to be, because it is exactly the kind of thing these people would have done. They danced their way across the Atlantic, the poorest passengers on the grandest ship, and they were, in those bright, loud evenings, as rich as anyone aboard. Put a few hundred young people on a ship for 5 days, separate the men and the women just enough to make it interesting, add nightly music and dancing, and you will get exactly what humans have always gotten in such situations. Romance. Tentative, hopeful, slightly seasick romance. The Titanic, for all its tragic future, was for a great many young people the setting of a genuine adventure, and adventures and young hearts have always gone together. The voyage threw together strangers from across the world, all of them on the brink of a new life, all of them feeling that particular electricity of leaving everything behind. It would have been stranger if nobody had fallen in love. The courtship of 1912 steerage was a delicate, public, heavily chaperoned affair, which is to say it was conducted almost entirely in glances. A young man would notice a young woman across the general room. He would then spend approximately 3 days finding reasons to be wherever she was. while pretending to be there for completely unrelated reasons, a strategy that has fooled absolutely no one in the entire history of human attraction. The young woman, for her part, would be perfectly aware of all of it, and would arrange to remain magnificently oblivious, because that was the game, and everyone knew the rules even when they shared no common language. Mothers watched. Mothers always watched. A mother could track the trajectory of a budding romance across a crowded room without ever appearing to look up from her knitting, and could intervene, when necessary, with a single perfectly timed summons of her daughter's name. The chaperones of steerage were not paid professionals like those of the upper decks. They were simply every older woman present, operating as a kind of distributed moral surveillance network with terrifying coverage. But love, being love, found its gaps. A few words exchanged in the food queue, a dance properly witnessed but thrillingly close, a shared joke that needed no translation, a walk on the open deck in the cold, suitably accompanied, but with the wind and the spray and the endless romantic sea doing most of the work. By the third or fourth day there were couples in steerage, official and unofficial, watched and unwatched, each one a small private universe of hope. And some of these romances were not new at all. Some couples were already engaged, already married, already crossing together to build a life in America, the whole point of the journey being the future they would share. For them the ship was the threshold, the in-between place, the last stretch of water before the rest of their lives began. It is unbearable, knowing what we know, to think about these couples. The ones just beginning, who had 3 more days. The ones already bound together, who had crossed half the world side by side. We will not stay here long, because it hurts, and because tonight is for rest. But know this. On the lower decks of the Titanic in those 5 days, people fell in love. They flirted and blushed and danced and dreamed, exactly as people always have and always will. Whatever else the sea took, it could not take that it had happened. For a little while, on the grandest ship in the world, the poorest passengers were young and in love and bound for paradise. Now we have to talk about the gates, the barriers, the locked doors and the steel partitions that divided the ship into its rigid layers of human worth. Because this, more than the bathtubs or the cabbage, is the thing about third class on the Titanic that history has never quite been able to forgive. There were a lot of children in third class. This is one of the quietest, saddest and most important facts about the poor on the Titanic, and we're going to sit with it gently, because they deserve at least that. Steerage was full of families, and families meant children, dozens upon dozens of them, of every age, from babies in arms to gangly, almost grown youths pretending they were too old to play, and then playing anyway the moment they thought no one was watching. They came from everywhere, spoke everything, and shared the one universal language of childhood, which is the language of running, shrieking, and getting into places you absolutely should not be. For these children, the voyage was paradise. Think about it from their height. No school, no chores, no fields, no factory, no minding the younger ones while mother worked. Just an enormous, warm, endlessly fascinating metal world, full of corridors to race down and stairs to thunder up and grown-ups too tired or too seasick to stop them. The general room was a racetrack. The open deck was an adventure. The whole ship was a gift, and they unwrapped it at full speed every single day. Their parents, of course, lived in a state of low-grade terror. A ship is an excellent place to lose a child. There are stairwells and machinery and railings, and 700 other people for a small person to vanish into. Mothers counted heads obsessively. The cry of "where is," followed by a child's name, became a regular percussion through the lower decks. And yet, by some miracle of collective parenting, the children mostly survived their own enthusiasm, scooped back from danger again and again by whichever adult happened to be nearest. Because down here, every child was, in a sense, everyone's child. There were toys, the few precious ones a family could carry, a doll, a spinning top, a ball that became, instantly, communal property and the centre of fierce international diplomacy. There were games invented on the spot, with rules that changed constantly and were understood by no one over the age of 9. There were friendships formed in an afternoon between children who could not exchange a single word, bonded entirely by the shared project of being young and free and gloriously temporarily unsupervised. You watch them, lying there in the dark, and you smile, because children are the same in every century, and there is something deeply comforting about that. The world changes, the ships get bigger, and then they sink. But a child finding the longest corridor on the ship and running down it screaming with joy, that is eternal. We will not dwell tonight on what came after, on the brutal arithmetic of who lived and who did not. It is enough for now to know that for 5 bright days the poorest children in the world had the time of their lives aboard the most famous ship ever built. They ran, and they played, and they laughed, and they slept soundly in their narrow bunks, dreaming of America. Let them play a little longer. We have all night. Every evening after supper, when the plates were cleared and the children were beginning to wilt, something wonderful happened in the general room. The music started. It began usually with a single instrument, a fiddle drawn from a battered case, a set of bagpipes, which is a brave choice in any enclosed space, a melodeon, an accordion, a tin whistle, whatever a passenger had been unable to leave behind, because for the poor, a musical instrument is often the one possession that comes before food, before sense, before reason. You can't eat a fiddle, but a fiddle can feed something else, something just as hungry. And then there was the piano, that upright piano the company had provided sitting in the corner of the general room. And the moment someone sat down and began to play, the whole atmosphere shifted. Heads came up. Feet began to tap. The exhausted, the homesick, the seasick, all of them turned toward the sound the way plants turn toward the sun. The dancing followed, and it was glorious chaos. This was not the stiff, formal, choreographed dancing of the first-class ballroom, all gloves and posture and quiet conversation. This was real dancing, Irish jigs and reels, the dancers' feet hammering the deck, Swedish folk dances. Whatever the Lebanese travellers danced, the others watching and clapping and trying to join in and getting it wonderfully wrong. The music collided and merged. A tune nobody knew became a tune everybody knew within minutes, because joy is the easiest thing in the world to learn. The young people danced because they were young, and because there were young people of the opposite sort nearby, and because a ship crossing an ocean is one of the most romantic situations the universe has ever devised, whether you can afford it or not. The old people danced because they remembered being young, and because the music dragged them up out of their chairs, whether their knees agreed or not. The Titanic was not one ship. It was 3, stacked and sealed against each other. First class up top in their floating palace, second class in the comfortable middle, and third class below, walled off, with the boundaries between the classes marked not by signs or suggestion, but by actual physical barriers, gates, grills, doors that locked. Now, here is the complicated truth, the one that doesn't fit neatly into a film. These barriers were not built purely so that rich people wouldn't have to smell poor people, although again that was a genuine and stated concern of the era. They were built largely because of American immigration law. The United States required that steerage passengers, the immigrants, be kept separate from the rest, so that on arrival they could be funneled through medical inspection without mixing with the first and second class passengers who breezed through customs while the poor were examined like suspect cargo. The gates were, in part, a quarantine, a border drawn through the middle of a ship, so in normal operation, the gates simply kept you in your place. You could move freely through the generous third-class areas, your dining saloon, your general room, your patch of open deck. But you could not wander up into first class. The corridors that connected the decks were gated, and the gates were watched, and a steerage passenger who tried to go exploring among his betters would be politely, firmly, and immediately turned back. For 5 days this was merely an annoyance, a humiliation so routine you barely registered it. Of course you couldn't go up there. Of course the grand staircase and the palm court and the promenade were not for you. You had never expected otherwise. You were poor. The world was built in layers, and you knew which layer was yours, and you had made your peace with it long before you ever set foot on a ship. But a gate that keeps you in your place during a pleasant voyage becomes something very different when the water starts coming in. A locked door that is merely an insult on a calm afternoon becomes a death sentence on a freezing night. The very architecture that organised the ship so neatly in life would organise it just as neatly in death, and the layer you were born into, the layer you'd paid your 7 hard-won pounds to occupy, would turn out to be the layer the water reached first and the rescue reached last. We are not there yet. The gates are still just gates. You walk past one tonight, glance up the forbidden stairway toward the warm golden light of a world you'll never see, shrug, and go back to your music and your bunk and your fellow travellers. It's fine. It's always been fine. That's how the world works. Sleep now. The gates aren't going anywhere. That, it will turn out, is exactly the problem. Let's indulge ourselves just for a moment and float up through all those gates and barriers to see how the other half is travelling. Not because you'll ever see it, but because the contrast is so absurd that it loops back around into a kind of bedtime story. 4 decks above your narrow bunk, the wealthiest people in the world are having a slightly different experience of the same voyage. Where you have a wash basin, they have private bathrooms with hot and cold running seawater, and fresh water both. Where you have 2 bathtubs for 700 people, a single first-class suite has more bathing options than your entire village. Where you have a patch of cold open deck, they have an enclosed promenade, a gymnasium with mechanical horses and mechanical camels, a squash court, a swimming pool, and a Turkish bath done up like a sultan's palace. Their dining room is a cathedral, 11 courses if they want them. Oysters and salmon and filet mignon and roast duckling and pâté de foie gras, and a parade of puddings and a different wine for each act of the performance. There is a separate à la carte restaurant for the truly particular, where the very richest can pay extra to avoid eating with the merely rich. The menus are printed fresh each day. The silver is real. The flowers are fresh, on a ship, in the middle of the ocean, because someone, somewhere, decided that the wealthy must never go a single meal without something blooming. They dress for dinner every night. The men in white tie and tails, the women in gowns from Paris that cost more than the Titanic paid the men shoveling coal in a year. They descend that famous grand staircase, beneath the glass dome and the carved cherub holding his lamp, and they are announced, and they glide, and they perform the great unhurried theatre of being important. After dinner the men retreat to the smoking room with its leather chairs and its real fireplace. Yes, a fireplace, on a ship, to drink brandy and discuss the markets and arrange, between cigars, the casual movement of fortunes that could buy and sell every soul in steerage 1,000 times over. The women take coffee in the reception room. An orchestra plays. The whole thing runs on the quiet, total confidence of people who have never once in their lives been told they could not have something. And here is the strange part, the part worth holding on to in the dark. They were not mostly cruel people. They simply lived in a different world, one that happened to be stacked directly on top of yours, separated by a few decks of steel and an unbridgeable ocean of circumstance. They did not think about you much because they did not have to. You were the hum beneath the floor. You were the part of the ship that made it go. You will never see any of it. The grand staircase, the dome, the fireplace, the orchestra, the oysters, none of it. You'll cross the entire Atlantic a few decks below the most beautiful rooms ever put to sea, and you'll never lay eyes on them. And on the 5th night, when the bow tips down toward the black water, that staircase and that dome and that fireplace will fill with the same freezing sea that fills your corridors. The ocean, it turns out, is the one thing on the Titanic that never checked anyone's ticket. If there was one subject that could light up the general room brighter than the music, it was America, the promised land. The whole reason any of you had spent everything you had to climb aboard this floating gamble. And nobody, but nobody, actually knew what was waiting there. So you traded rumours. America, by the firelight of steerage gossip, was a place of dizzying, contradictory wonders. The streets, someone's cousin had written, were practically paved with work, good work, paying work, for anyone willing to do it. Wages were so high they sounded like jokes. A man could eat meat every day. A man could own land, real land, his own land, an idea so intoxicating to people whose families had worked other men's fields for centuries that it barely seemed real. There were warnings woven through the wonders. America was also a place where they could send you straight back if your eyes were wrong, or your papers were wrong, or you couldn't show you had enough money, or you simply gave the wrong answer to the wrong official on the wrong day. Everyone had heard of someone, a cousin of a friend of a neighbour, who had crossed the whole ocean only to be turned around at the gates and shipped home in disgrace. The fear of being sent back ran underneath every conversation like a cold current. You pieced together your picture of America from these fragments, from letters read aloud and reread until the paper went soft, from the boasts of returning emigrants, from the breathless promises of the steamship advertisements that had lured you here in the first place. You knew the names: New York, Chicago, the vast farmlands of the Dakotas and Minnesota, hungry for Scandinavian hands. You knew the names the way you knew the names of saints, as places of power and miracle where, if you were good and lucky and worked yourself half to death, your children might have a different life than you did. That was the real prize, of course, not for yourself. You were too old, too tired, too marked by the life you had already lived to expect much. The dream was for the children running and shrieking through the general room right now, oblivious, would grow up American. They would speak English without an accent. They would never know the hunger you knew. They would forget the old country, and you would let them, because forgetting was the whole point, because you had sold the cow and burned the bridges and crossed the freezing sea precisely so that your children would have nothing to remember. So you sat in the warm, crowded general room and you talked about America, and the talk was a kind of prayer. You polished the dream and passed it around and added your own hopes to it and handed it back. 3 more days. 3 more days of this strange, comfortable limbo, and then the cranes of New York and the inspectors and the rest of your life. You could almost see it. You went to sleep that night seeing it. The harbour, the crowds, the future, bright and close and certain. It was so close. That's the thing that breaks your heart later, when you let it. It was so very close. You didn't expect to be looked after. That was not a thing that happened to people like you. And yet there they were, the third-class stewards, in their White Star uniforms, whose entire job was the care and feeding and herding of 700 poor strangers, and who did it, by and large, with a patience that bordered on the saintly. Consider what their days were like. They rang the bell for meals and then served those meals, sitting after sitting, to a dining saloon full of people who spoke a dozen languages and had 100 questions and at least one screaming infant at all times. They cleaned the cabins and the corridors. They answered the same queries over and over in slow, loud English, to passengers who understood perhaps 1 word in 5. They settled disputes, found lost children, soothed the seasick, and maintained a sort of cheerful order over a floating village of the anxious and the overwhelmed. There was one steward, often assigned to look after a particular block of cabins, and over 5 days he became a familiar face, a fixed point, the one member of the crew you actually knew. He learned which families were which. He developed a soft spot for certain children, and a wary eye for certain card games. He became, in his uniform and his briskness, a small daily reassurance that this enormous strange experience was being managed by someone who knew what he was doing. It is worth remembering them, because on the last night, many of these same stewards did something that the gates and the rules did not require of them. They went down into the rising water and the rising panic, into the maze they knew and you did not, and they led people up. They unlocked things, they carried children. They called the lost toward the high decks and voices going hoarse, and a great many of them did not come back because they kept going down for one more group and then one more, until there was no more time. The third-class stewards were working men themselves, only a rung or two above the passengers they served, men with families of their own waiting in Southampton, men who had taken a job on a ship the way you'd taken a ticket on one, because it was the best chance going. They were not heroes by trade, they were waiters and cleaners and bell ringers, and on the worst night of all, a remarkable number of them chose to spend their last hour trying to save people the ship had been built to leave behind. So tonight, while it is still only the first night, and the steward is just a brisk, friendly fellow ringing a bell for supper, give him a nod. He has no idea what is coming, neither do you. But he is going to be, for some of the people sleeping around you, the difference between the boats and the dark, and he is going to pay for it. The least we can do, a century on, is remember that the care was real, even here, even at the bottom of the ship. Let's take an inventory, because the entire material wealth of a steerage passenger could be counted, and counted quickly. And there is something clarifying about knowing exactly how little a person needs to carry an entire life across an ocean. There is the bag, or the case, or the bundle. One of them, usually occasionally two for a whole family. Into it has gone everything that survived the great purge of departure, the brutal triage every emigrant performs, in which you stand in your emptying home and decide what is worth the wait. Clothes, the practical ones, the warm ones, a second pair of boots if you're lucky and fortunate beyond reason, a shawl, a blanket from home, because a familiar blanket is not a luxury. It is a piece of the place you are leaving, something to put your face into in the dark when the homesickness comes. There are the small sacred things, a photograph perhaps, of the people you are leaving behind, the parents too old to come, the brother who stayed, the grave you will never visit again, a Bible, or a prayer book, or a rosary, or whatever object holds your faith for you, because faith travels light and weighs nothing and is needed most exactly when everything else is gone. A letter, the one from the cousin in America, the one with the address, the one that is the entire foundation of your plan, read so many times the folds have gone furry. There is the money, always the money, sewn into the coat, hidden in the lining, tucked somewhere the pickpockets and the inspectors and the bad luck cannot easily reach. It is not much. It is in fact almost nothing. The scrapings of everything you sold, just enough, you hope, to satisfy the American officials that you will not immediately become a burden, just enough to survive the first weeks until the work begins. You know to the penny how much there is. You do the sum in your head as you fall asleep, the way other people count sheep. And there are the tools, for some. A man bringing his trade to the new world carries the trade in his hands, but also, where he can, in his bag, the specific worn implements of his craft, because a skilled man with his own tools is a man with a future, and a skilled man without them is just another pair of hands. The cobbler's awl, the carpenter's plane, the fiddle, which is a tool too, the tool of joy, carried at the expense of more sensible things, by people who understood that you cannot build a life out of sensible things alone. That is the whole of it. That is everything a person owns, fitting in a bag, weighing less than the dream stuffed in alongside it. It is a strange and humbling thing to realize how little it takes, materially, to be a human being on the move. Everything that matters, the photograph and the faith and the money and the tools and the blanket that smells of home, all of it tucked under a narrow bunk in the belly of a ship. Most of it went down with that ship. The bags, the blankets, the photographs, the tools, the letters with the addresses, all of it sank into the cold dark because when the water came you grabbed your children, not your things, as anyone would, as everyone did. The survivors arrived in America with nothing at all, not even the almost nothing they had started with. But they arrived, some of them, holding the only thing that had ever really mattered, which was each other, and which weighs nothing, and which no sea can take if you hold on tight enough. A village needs an economy, even a floating temporary one, and steerage developed its own in about a day and a half, because human beings cannot be in a confined space together for more than a few hours without inventing ways to win small amounts of each other's money. The cards came out first. They always do. Somewhere in steerage, in every era, there is a deck of cards and a man who believes, with magnificent unfounded confidence, that he is good at using it. Games sprang up in the general room, in the corners of the dining saloon between sittings, on the cargo hatches of the open deck when the weather allowed. The stakes were small because the players were poor, but the seriousness was total, because when you have very little, even a very little is worth fighting for. There was certainly the occasional sharp operator, the man whose luck was suspiciously consistent, who knew exactly how to relieve a hopeful young emigrant of a few of his precious coins. The old hands warned the young ones. The young ones, being young, ignored the warnings, lost their money, and learned the lesson the expensive way, which is the only way anyone has ever truly learned it. It is one of history's great constants that you cannot tell a young man anything. You can only watch him discover it. Beyond the cards, there was barter and trade, and the small, constant flow of favours that holds any community together. A woman who could sew mended a tear in exchange for a share of someone's sweets. A man who spoke 2 languages translated and was repaid in tobacco, or company, or simply in being useful, which is its own kind of currency to a person far from home. Food was shared, and shared back. The unofficial economy of generosity running alongside the official one of the dining saloon, because hospitality among the poor is not a transaction, it is a religion. Tobacco was money. It nearly always is, in any place where people are confined and bored and slightly anxious. A pinch of decent tobacco could buy a great deal of goodwill in steerage, and the men gathered to smoke and trade and complain in the universal manner of men everywhere. The smoke hanging in the close air, the conversation circling endlessly around money and America, and the maddening behaviour of the seas. And underneath all of it ran the great obsession, the thing every single passenger was quietly calculating at every moment, which was simply this. Will I have enough? Enough to satisfy the inspectors? Enough to last until the work starts? Enough to be allowed to stay, to begin, to build the thing I crossed the world to build? The card games and the barter and the tobacco were all, in the end, played in the long shadow of that question, the poor man's eternal arithmetic, the sum that never quite came out right. It was a small economy, and a poor one, and it vanished without a trace on the 5th night along with everything else. But for 5 days it hummed along beautifully, the cards slapping down, the favours flowing, the tobacco changing hands, a whole little world of getting and giving and quietly trying to come out ahead, built from nothing, by people who had nothing, simply because that is what people do. We cannot help it. Put us anywhere, even at the bottom of a doomed ship, and we will start trading. It is almost the most human thing about us. Here is something the films never show you, because it would be deadly to watch, and is the single most accurate fact about any sea voyage of any era. Most of the time, on the Titanic, in steerage, absolutely nothing was happening, and it was happening very slowly for hours and hours and hours. A crossing takes days, the engines hum, the sea rolls by, identical mile after identical mile, the horizon refusing on principle to ever get any closer. There is no land to look at. There is no news from the outside world worth speaking of. There is only the ship, the same rooms, the same faces, the same grey heaving water, and the vast oceanic boredom that has been the true experience of sea travel since the first fool pushed a log into the water and climbed aboard. So you learn to pass the time, which is a skill, an art, and one that the modern world with its endless glowing distractions has very nearly lost. You talked. Lord, how you talked. Steerage ran on conversation, the long meandering low-stakes conversation of people with nothing but time, stories told and retold and improved with each telling, gossip about your fellow passengers, debates about America, arguments about religion conducted across language barriers, and therefore entirely without resolution, and somehow all the more enjoyable for it. You watched. Watching other people is the oldest entertainment there is, and a crowded ship offers an endless supply. You learn the dramas of strangers, the budding romance in the corner, the feud between two families over some imagined slight, the card player on his lucky streak, the seasick young man making his peace with God by the rail. The general room was theatre, and admission was free, and the show ran all day. You slept more than you needed to, because sleeping is an excellent way to make time disappear, and a warm bunk on a full stomach is a powerful temptation when there is nothing else demanding your attention. You doze through the grey afternoons to the hum of the engines, the gentlest lullaby ever written, the deep mechanical heartbeat that rocked the whole great ship and everyone in it, and you waited. Above all, you waited. The entire voyage was a held breath, a long suspended pause between two lives, and steerage learned to wait the way the poor have always learned to wait, with patience, with resignation, with the occasional flare of impatience quickly swallowed, because impatience changes nothing and only tires you out. America would come when it came. The ship would arrive when it arrived. There was nothing to do but fill the hours and let the sea do its slow work. It sounds dull. It was dull. And yet there is a part of you, lying there in the overstimulated present, that aches for it a little, for that lost art of the empty hour, for boredom so deep it had to be filled with talk and watching and dreaming, and the simple animal contentment of being warm and fed with nowhere to be. The poor on the Titanic were bored out of their minds for 5 days, and it may have been, though none of them would have said so, one of the most peaceful stretches of their entire hard-working lives. Boredom, it turns out, is a luxury too. They just didn't know it yet. You only ever find that out afterward. And so, each night, the great floating village went to bed, and there was a ritual to it, a settling that anyone who has ever shared a crowded home will recognise in their bones. It began with the slow winding down of the general room. The music finally stopped, the last reluctant dancers giving up, the piano falling silent, the fiddle returned to its case. The card games broke up, the winners smug, the losers philosophical, all of them yawning. The talk thinned out and went quiet and then died. One by one, family by family, the passengers drifted off toward their cabins, scooping up sleeping children who had long since run themselves into exhaustion and would have to be carried, boneless and heavy, to their bunks. The corridors filled briefly with the traffic of bedtime, the last visit to the lavatory, the last fill of water at the basin, the murmured good nights across languages, the small collisions and apologies of too many tired people in too narrow a space. Mothers performed the final head count of the day. Fathers checked, one last time, that the money was where the money should be. The old hands, who had done this all before, were already asleep, having learned long ago that sleep is the one thing on a ship that is genuinely free and unlimited. Inside the cabin, you settled onto your own narrow bunk, the one that still, even on the 5th night, felt like an unreasonable luxury. You pulled the rough white star blanket up. You arranged yourself in the small space, learning its dimensions, the trick of turning over without falling out, a skill you had very nearly mastered. Above you, and below you, and across from you, your accidental family did the same, the whole cabin creaking and rustling and settling like a nest. And then came the sounds of the ship sleeping. The snoring, of course, in its full international variety, the talkative Irishman leading the chorus, the creak of the steel as the great hull worked gently against the sea, the cry, somewhere down the corridor, of a baby who disagreed with the whole concept of nighttime, soothed back to silence by a patient, exhausted mother. And underneath it all, always, the engines, the deep, endless hum that you no longer consciously heard, but that held you, that rocked you, that promised in its steady, mechanical voice that the ship was alive and working and carrying you safely on through the dark toward morning. You closed your eyes. You thought, as you did every night about America, the harbour, the work, the children's bright forgetting future, the whole golden impossible dream now just a day or two away. You thought about the cow you'd sold and decided again that it had been worth it, that this strange, comfortable floating limbo was already more than you'd had any right to expect, that whatever waited at the far end, you had at least had these 5 remarkable days. And then sleep took you, easy and deep in your own warm bunk, full and safe, rocked by the engines, surrounded by the breathing dark of all the others, the poorest passengers on the grandest ship in the world, dreaming the same dream in a dozen languages, sleeping soundly through the nights, soundly through the 4th night, soundly into the 5th. Sleep well, traveller. You always did down here. Right up until the engine stopped. Not everything in steerage was music and dreaming. A great deal of it, frankly, was laundry. Because life, even on the grandest ship in the world, even mid-ocean, even on the way to paradise, is mostly made of small, dull tasks, and the poor have never been excused from a single one of them. Consider your clothes. You're wearing most of them, remember, because that was easier than packing. But 5 days in the same garments, in a warm, crowded ship, with seasickness and spilled food, and the general business of living takes a toll. There is no laundry service for you, obviously. There are no fresh shirts pressed and returned by morning, as there are for the gentlemen upstairs. There is you, a bit of soap if you are wise enough to bring it, and a basin of cold water that several other people have ideas about using. So you do what you can. You sponge a stain. You rinse a child's shirt that has met with an accident and drape it somewhere to dry, which in the damp, crowded air takes approximately forever and leaves everything with a faintly mildewed perfume. You learn to live in clothes that are not quite clean, because the alternative is clothes that are wet, and wet is worse than dirty in a cold ship on a cold sea. There is the matter of keeping your few possessions safe. Steerage is honest, mostly, in the way that desperate crowded places are forced to be honest, because there is nowhere to hide and everyone is watching. But not entirely. You keep your money close, sewn in, hidden, checked. You keep your ticket and your papers closer still, because those scraps of paper are the difference between America and a humiliating voyage home. A poor traveller learns to carry their whole world on their body and to sleep lightly over it. There is boredom, which we will come to properly. There is the constant low management of children, of seasickness, of small disputes over space and noise and whose turn it is at the basin. There is the ache of homesickness that comes at odd moments, when a particular song is played, or a smell drifts by, or the light hits the sea a certain way and you think, with a pang that surprises you, of a place you chose to leave and will almost certainly never see again. And yet there were comforts too, woven through the small miseries, and they were all the sweeter for being small. The warmth of the general room after the cold deck, the first cup of tea in the morning before the children woke, a kind word from a stranger in a language you didn't share but understood completely, the astonishing, repeated, never quite believed miracle of a full plate at the sound of a bell. This is the texture of ordinary life, and ordinary life is what steerage mostly was. Not tragedy, not yet. Just hundreds of poor people doing the small things people do, washing and worrying and dozing and getting on with it, suspended for 5 days between the world they'd left and the world they were promised, on a ship that did not know, any more than they did, that it was famous already, and for the worst possible reason. Rest now. The laundry can wait. The laundry can always wait. In a floating village of 700 people, somebody was always a little bit sick, and the question of what happened then is one of those small practical matters that nobody puts in a film but everybody lived through. There was a ship surgeon and an assistant surgeon, proper doctors carried by the White Star Line, but their attention was, like everything else on the ship, arranged by class. The wealthy upstairs could summon medical care to their suites with the pull of a bell. For steerage, illness was a hardier, more communal affair, managed mostly by the passengers themselves with the home remedies they'd carried from a dozen different countries, a great floating pharmacy of folk wisdom, half of it sensible and half of it the kind of thing that has been quietly killing people for centuries. For the everyday complaints, you coped. The seasickness, of course, which we have already suffered through together. The coughs and colds that race through any crowded space like gossip. The upset stomachs of children who have eaten too much wonderful unfamiliar food too quickly. The headaches, the aching backs, the small chronic miseries of bodies that had worked hard their whole lives and did not stop aching just because they'd boarded a ship. You had your remedies, a particular tea, a poultice your grandmother swore by, a great deal of lying still and hoping. But there was a deeper fear underneath the everyday one, and it was the fear of being seen to be ill at the wrong moment. Remember the inspectors waiting in America. Remember the whole apparatus built to turn back the sick and the weak. A serious illness aboard was not just a misery, it was a threat to the entire dream. A fever that lingered, a rash that spread, a cough that sounded too deep. Any of these might mean being held at the far end, examined, questioned, possibly sent all the way back. So there was an instinct, among the poor, to hide sickness, to soldier on, to insist you were perfectly well even as you swayed on your feet, because admitting weakness was a luxury you could not afford. The mothers watched their children with particular dread. A child's fever in the night could mean any of 100 things, most of them survivable, a few of them not, and there was no easy way to tell which, and the nearest proper help was a surgeon several decks and several social classes away. So, a mother would sit up through the dark hours with a hot, fretful child in a narrow bunk, pressing a cool cloth to a small forehead, listening to the breathing, counting the minutes until dawn, praying in whatever language she prayed in that this was nothing, just a chill, just teething, just one of the ordinary frights of having brought a small life into a hard world. Mostly it was nothing. Mostly the fever broke, the cough eased, the child was bouncing around the general room again by afternoon, the terror of the night forgotten by everyone except the mother, who would carry it, the way mothers do. The poor were tough. They had to be. They had survived childhoods that would have finished most modern adults, and they had a deep, practical, unsentimental relationship with their own fragile bodies, patching themselves up and pressing on because there had never been any other option. It is a strange thing to think about on this particular voyage. All that careful tending of small illnesses, all that anxious watching over feverish children, all that hiding of coughs from the inspectors, all of it aimed at staying healthy enough to be allowed into America and the long life that waited there. And then the 5th night came, and the cold Black Sea, and it turned out that health had nothing to do with anything, that the strongest and the sickest went down together, that no remedy in any grandmother's bag was any use at all against an iceberg and a shortage of boats. But they didn't know that, tending their children in the warm nights. They thought the danger was a fever. They thought, if they could just stay well, they were going to be fine. Sleep now. The children's fevers all broke. On this, at least, let the night be kind. Let's address, briefly and with great delicacy, the plumbing. Because no honest account of life among the poor on the Titanic would be complete without acknowledging that 700 people had to, at various points, use the facilities. The facilities, like everything else in third class, were communal, and they were not numerous, and they were located in fixed spots that you would come to know intimately and resent personally. There were lavatories for men and lavatories for women shared among hundreds, which meant queues, because of course it meant queues. The entire experience of being poor on the Titanic could be summarised as standing in a line for something, and the line for the lavatory was the most democratic line of all, because it came for everyone eventually, regardless of nationality, fortune, or how brave they'd felt at the dock. Now, by the standards of the time, the arrangements were perfectly modern. Flushing toilets, running water, a vast improvement over the chamber pots and outhouses, and frankly horrifying arrangements that many steerage passengers had left behind in the old country. To you, the third-class lavatory on the Titanic, for all its queues and its lack of privacy, is a marvel of plumbing, a glimpse of the gleaming sanitary future. You have known far, far worse. You will not be complaining about a flushing toilet. You'd have wept with gratitude for one back home. But the contrast, as ever, is the thing. Upstairs, a first-class passenger has a private bathroom, or near enough, attended and immaculate, with thick towels and good soap and not another living soul to share it with. The very richest never wait for anything, never queue, never time their bodily needs around the movements of 600 strangers. Down here you plan your day, quietly, around the rhythms of the lavatory queue, and you become an expert in its timings, the slow morning rush, the quiet mid-afternoon lull, the optimal moments known only to the wise. There was seasickness to complicate matters in the early days, which we will not describe further out of respect for your evening. There were children who have no sense of timing whatsoever and announce their needs with the urgency of a fire alarm at the least convenient possible moment. There was the general business of keeping a shared space usable when it is used by hundreds, which depended, as such things always do, on the basic decency of strangers, and which mostly held together. It is not a glamorous subject. It does not appear in the films, where nobody on the Titanic ever seems to need a lavatory, first class or third, as though the wealthy and the poor alike were sustained entirely by orchestral music and meaningful glances. But real people have real bodies, and real bodies have real needs, and the poor on the Titanic met those needs in queues, with patience, with the soap they'd remembered to bring, grateful, on balance, for plumbing that worked. We will say no more about it. You'll be relieved to hear that, in every sense. The 5th day was a Sunday, and Sunday at sea had its own particular rhythm, its own quiet, its own gravity. Even on a ship rolling toward the future at 22 knots, the old shape of the week held, and Sunday was the Lord's Day, and the poor, who had little else, often had their faith and held it close. There were religious services of a sort scattered through the ship according to the rigid logic of class. In first class, a grand service in the dining saloon, the captain himself presiding, hymns sung by the wealthy in their Sunday best beneath the electric lights. In second class, their own gathering, and in third, the poor worshipped as the poor always have, in their own corners, in their own ways, in their own languages, with whatever clergy happened to be travelling among them, or simply with their own remembered prayers. It was a ship of many faiths, Irish Catholics, fingering rosaries worn smooth by generations of hands, Scandinavian Lutherans, solemn and steady, Eastern Orthodox travellers, and Jews and Muslims among the Lebanese, and every shade of belief that the great migration of the desperate had swept up and carried west together. They did not share a church, they did not share a God, not exactly. But they shared the act, the bowing of the head, the asking, the strange comfort of speaking into the silence and trusting that something listened. There is something piercing about it, knowing what we know. All those prayers, rising up through the decks of the doomed ship on its last full day, in a dozen languages to a dozen versions of heaven. Prayers for safe passage, prayers for the family back home, prayers for the new life ahead, for work, for health, for the children. Prayers of simple gratitude from people who had so little and were so grateful for the full plates and the warm room and the astonishing fact of being aboard the greatest ship in the world. The day itself was calm. The sea had settled. The cold, which had been deepening for days, took a sharp turn that Sunday, the temperature dropping and dropping until the open decks emptied of all but the hardiest, until the air had a knife in it, until the older sailors looked at the flat black water and the windless sky and felt, without quite knowing why, that something was not right. The sea was too still. The air was too cold. The kind of cold that means ice, somewhere ahead, in the dark. But you didn't know that. You weren't a sailor. You spent your Sunday as you'd spent the others, in the warm general room, with the music and the talk and the children and the endless gorgeous dreaming about America, which was now so close you could almost taste it. One more night, land in a day or two, the whole impossible gamble nearly won. You went to bed that Sunday night content, full, tired in the good way, your prayers said, your children sleeping, your ticket safe in its pocket. The engines hummed their lullaby. The ship rolled gently west through the flat, black, freezing sea. It was just before midnight when the humming stopped. You woke, or half woke, to a strange quiet. That was the first thing, the thing that pulled you up out of sleep more surely than any noise could have. The engines, the great constant rumble that you'd stopped hearing days ago, the heartbeat of the ship, the sound you slept inside of like a child sleeps inside its mother's pulse. It had changed, it had slowed, and then, somewhere in the small hours, it had stopped altogether. There had been something too a few minutes before. You'd felt it more than heard it down here near the waterline, near the bow. A shudder, a long grinding tremor that ran through the steel and into your bunk and into your bones, the way you'd feel a cart go over rough cobbles, except the cart was the largest ship ever built and the cobbles were something out in the dark. It hadn't been loud. That was the strange thing that everyone would remember. It hadn't been a crash, not the way you'd imagine a crash. Just a long, low, scraping shiver, and then nothing. Some of your cabin mates slept right through it. The talkative Irishman snored on, but the calm older woman in the corner was awake, sitting up, listening, her face unreadable in the dim light. And up and down the corridor, you could hear doors opening, voices, the particular tone of people asking each other a question that nobody can answer. What was that? Did you feel that? Why have we stopped? You are near the bow. This matters. The poorest passengers, the single men especially, were berthed forward, down low, in the very part of the ship that had just met the iceberg. So while first class, far above and toward the middle, felt almost nothing, a faint jar, a trembling of the chandeliers, barely enough to interrupt a card game, you felt the real thing. You were closer to the wound. You always were. Some of the men got up to look. There are stories, and they have the ring of truth, of steerage passengers in the forward sections finding ice on the well deck, chunks of it, sprayed up onto the open steel when the berg scraped past. Young men, half-dressed, kicking lumps of ice around in the freezing dark, laughing, because what else would young men do? Because ice was funny, because the ship was unsinkable and a bit of ice on the deck was an adventure, a story to tell, nothing more. You did not feel afraid. Why would you? The crew were not afraid, or did not seem to be. No alarm sounded, no instructions came. The lights still burned, warm and electric and steady. The ship sat quiet on the flat black sea under a sky thick with stars, more stars than you had ever seen, the whole frozen, brilliant dome of them, because the night was so clear and so cold and so utterly, deceptively calm. So most of you went back to bed. You pulled the rough white star blanket back up to your chin. You told the worried ones it was nothing. They've stopped to check something. They'll start up again in a minute, go to sleep. The engines would surely rumble back to life any moment now. They had to. You had an ocean still to cross and a new life waiting at the end of it. You closed your eyes. Down below your bunk, below the floor, below the waterline, in the dark you could not see, the sea was already coming in. It started, as these things do, with the stewards. Footsteps in the corridor, brisk and too many. A knock on cabin doors. Voices telling you to get up, to dress, to put on your life belt. Not shouting, not yet. Just firm, just urgent enough to pull the sleep from your eyes and replace it with the first cold thread of doubt. A life belt. They want you in a life belt. You pull the bulky cork and canvas thing over your head, fumbling with the strings in the dim light, and the children watch you do it and want theirs too, and you tie the little ones into vests far too big for them, and the whole thing still feels half like a drill, half like a precaution, the sort of fuss a careful crew makes over nothing. The ship is unsinkable. Everyone has said so. You're simply being sensible. But the water tells a different story, and the water does not lie. Down in the very lowest, very furthest forward sections, where the poorest of the poor and the mail and the cargo lived, the sea was already climbing. Men who went to look came back wet to the knees and then wet to the waist, and the cold of it, that black Atlantic cold, was a cold that focused the mind wonderfully. Word travelled up through the steerage decks the way water travels down. Something is wrong. Something is really, truly wrong. You feel it underfoot before you fully believe it. A tilt. Faint at first, so slight you think you're imagining it. The floor of the corridor leaning ever so gently downward toward the bow. You put a hand on the wall. You watch a dropped shawl slide slowly, the wrong way. And the cold thread of doubt becomes something colder and harder, something with a name you don't want to say. The corridors fill with people, hundreds of them spilling from the cabins, half-dressed, clutching children and bundles, and the few precious things they cannot bear to leave even now. The languages collide louder than ever, but the music is gone from them. Now it is all questions, all urgency, all the rising shared panic of people who do not know where to go. Where do we go? Which way is up? What do the words mean? The words they're shouting. Does anyone understand the words? Some of you kneel and pray. Some weep. Some, with the steady, terrible calm of people who have already understood, simply begin to gather their families close, counting heads one more time, holding small hands, because if there is one thing you will not do tonight, whatever happens, it is let go of your children's hands. And some of you, God help you, still don't believe it. Still wait in the warm corridor for the crew to come and say it was a mistake. The engines will start, go back to bed. The mind protects itself. The mind does not want to know what the floor and the water and the cold already know. The ship leaned a little further toward the bow. The light still burned, steady and gold. And somewhere far above you, beyond all the gates, there were boats. Not enough of them, though none of you knew that yet. Not nearly enough. And they were already, in the freezing starlit dark, beginning to be lowered away. Here is the cruelest part. Here is the part that has never sat easily with anyone who has ever learned it. To reach the boats, you had to go up. And up from the bottom of the Titanic was very far away, through a ship that had been deliberately, carefully, lawfully designed to keep you down. You knew your own decks. You knew the dining saloon and the general room and your patch of open deck, the whole bright, friendly world of steerage that you'd come to love over 5 days. But you did not know the way up. Why would you? You had never been allowed up. The route to the boat deck ran through gates that had been locked or guarded for the entire voyage, up stairways and through corridors and across sections that belonged to your betters, a maze you had no map for, in a part of the ship you had been forbidden to enter since the moment you stepped aboard. Some found their way. Stewards, the good ones, the brave ones, led groups up through the labyrinth, calling them on, opening gates, shepherding the lost toward the high cold decks and the boats. There are stories of crewmen who went back down again and again into the rising water to bring more people up, and you must hold on to those stories because they are true and because the night needs them. But there were not enough guides, and there was not enough time, and there was the terrible, stupid, lethal barrier of language. The instructions, when they came in English. This way. Up here. Follow me. And the corridors were full of people who had crossed half the world without learning a word of it, who heard only urgent noise, who did not know whether the shouting man wanted them to follow or to wait, who hesitated at the wrong moment, who took the wrong turning, who stood frozen at a gate waiting for a permission that the rules of 5 days had taught them they always needed, and that no longer existed, and there were gates that stayed shut. There is no kind way to say it. In the maze of the lower decks, some of the barriers that had divided the classes all voyage remained closed, locked, or guarded against the press of steerage passengers trying to get up, while above them the boats were lowered half empty into the sea. Whether through orders, or panic, or the simple, fatal inertia of a system built to keep the poor in their place, the architecture of the ship did in death exactly what it had done in life. It held you down, so you climbed. You climbed with your children's hands locked in yours, up unfamiliar stairs, through doors that should not have been hard to find and were, lost in a beautiful deadly maze, the floor tilting further beneath you with every passing minute, the cold growing, the water somewhere below and behind and rising. You climbed past abandoned belongings and open cabin doors and the strange surreal normality of a ship still brightly lit and warm, even as it tipped toward the sea. You climbed toward the stars and the boats and the only chance you had. Some of you made it, many of you did not, and the ones who didn't were not lost because they were cowardly or slow or foolish. They were lost because they started at the bottom, and the bottom was the furthest from the boats, and the way up had been built, deliberately, to be hard. If you reached it, the boat deck, you arrived in a world transformed. The first time you had ever been allowed up here, into the realm of your betters, and you reached it on the worst night in the history of the sea. It was bitterly, impossibly cold. The kind of cold that takes your breath, that makes your eyes water and freezes the water on your lashes, that the thin clothes of the poor were never meant to stand against. The sky above was a blaze of stars, hard and brilliant in the moonless dark, and the sea around the ship was a flat black mirror, dead calm, beautiful, and so cold that to fall into it was to be given only minutes. There were the boats, hanging from their davits, swinging out over the black water, being filled and lowered one by one. And there was the order, the great rule of the sea that everyone knew without being told. Women and children first. It was not always honoured perfectly. It broke down in places into chaos and queue jumping and quiet heroism and quiet cowardice, the full range of what people are. But it was the rule, and on the boat deck that night it shaped who lived and who died as surely as the locked gates had. If you were a woman, a mother, with your children, and you made it up here in time, you might be lifted, weeping, into a boat. Your children passed down to you, lowered jerkily toward the sea while you watched the deck and the lights and your whole world tilt away above you. And your husband, your brother, your son, grown too old to count as a child, stood at the rail and watched you go, and did not get in, because the rule said he should not, and because there was no room, and because that was the kind of man he was. That was the moment. Not the iceberg, not the water, but that. The moment of separation on the cold high deck, the moment a family that had crossed an ocean together to start a new life together, was torn in two by a rule and a shortage of boats. The hands that had held each other's children all the way across the Atlantic, unclasping, the last looks, the promises shouted across the widening gap of black water, the promises that you'd meet again, in New York, in the boats, somewhere, anywhere, the promises that both of you, in your hearts, already knew were lies. Many steerage passengers never reached this deck at all. But those who did faced their own version of the impossible. To get in the boat and live, while leaving someone behind to die. To refuse the boat and stay together and die as one. Mothers who would not leave husbands. Whole families who chose, with a terrible quiet courage, to stay together to the end rather than be parted, and who sat down together in the warm lit corridors below to wait, and held each other, and were not afraid, or were afraid, and held each other anyway. The boats pulled away across the flat black water, half of them not even full, the rules and the panic and the cruelty and the kindness all tangled up together, and the great ship, ablaze with light, tilted further and further toward the bow, toward the sea, toward the dark, with most of the poor still aboard her. Let's speak plainly for a moment about the numbers, because the numbers tell the truth that the film sometimes blur with romance. The poor died. They died in far greater proportion than the rich, and it was not an accident, and it was not bad luck. It was arithmetic, written into the ship before she ever sailed. There were not enough lifeboats. This is the first and largest fact. The Titanic carried boats for around half the people aboard her, and she was not even full. The law of the time required only a certain number based on the ship's tonnage, not on the number of souls she carried, and so the grandest ship in the world set out across the Atlantic, with nowhere near enough room in the boats for the people who trusted her. Everyone, rich and poor alike, was short. But the rich were short at the top of the ship beside the boats. The poor were short at the bottom, behind the gates, at the end of the maze. And so when you look at who survived, the pattern is stark enough to break your heart. Among first-class passengers, the great majority of women and children lived. Among second class, most of the children lived and many of the women. But among third class, among the poor, among your people, the numbers collapse. Most of the women in steerage died. Most of the children in steerage died. Children. The ones running and shrieking with joy through the general room a day before. The ones who were going to grow up American and forget the old country. The ones the whole desperate gamble had been for. Think about that gently, in the dark. In first and second class, almost every child was saved. In third class, most of the children were not. The same ship, the same night, the same freezing sea. The difference was not courage, and it was not chance. The difference was a few decks of steel, a set of locked gates, a maze of unfamiliar corridors, a language barrier, and a society that had decided long before the iceberg exactly whose lives came first. The men of steerage died in the greatest numbers of all, but then the men of every class died, held back by the rule of women and children first, standing aside at the boats. There is a grim dignity in that, shared across the classes, the one place where rich and poor met something like equality that night. The men of the Titanic standing back together to let the boats go. But the children. The arithmetic of the children is the thing that cannot be forgiven or explained away. It is the cold, hard centre of what it meant to be poor on the Titanic. You could be good and brave and lucky and quick, and it might not be enough, because the system had done its sums in advance, and in those sums your life, and your children's lives, had simply been weighted less. That is the truth under the romance. That is what the gates were for, in the end, whatever anyone intended. Hold it for a moment. Then let us go back to the people, because they were never numbers, not really. They were a Finnish grandmother teaching an Irish boy to count. They were every one of them somebody's whole world. In the end, the sea came up to meet her. After 2.5 hours of slow, almost gentle dying, after the boats had gone and the band had played and the lights had burned impossibly on, the great ship gave up her long argument with gravity, and the bow slid under, and the stern rose against the blazing stars, and the Titanic went down into the black Atlantic and took most of the poor with her. We will be tender here, because there is no other way to be. The water that night was just below freezing, around 28 degrees on the old Fahrenheit scale, cold enough to kill a strong man in minutes, cold enough that the life belts, the cork and canvas vests you'd tied so carefully onto your children, would keep a body floating long after the cold had stopped the heart. The life belts did their job. That was the horror of it. They held you up in the freezing dark so that the sea could take its time. For those who went into the water, and hundreds did, rich and poor together at the last, the end came not by drowning but by cold. A great cry went up from the sea after the ship was gone, the sound of all those people in the water, a sound the survivors in the boats would carry to their own graves and never be able to describe and never be able to forget. And then, over long minutes, the cry thinned and faded, and one by one fell silent, as the cold did its quiet work under the most beautiful sky any of them had ever seen. The boats, most of them, did not go back. This is another hard truth of the night. They had room, many of them, room that had been left empty when they were lowered half full, but they hung back in the dark, afraid of being swamped by the desperate hundreds, and by the time a few of them found the courage to row back into that field of the dying, there was almost no one left to save. The sea had taken them. The poor, who had started the night furthest from the boats, ended it furthest from rescue, floating in their lifebelts in the dark, going cold, going still, going home to whatever heaven they had prayed to that last quiet Sunday. Somewhere out there was the talkative Irishman, who had a cousin in Boston and a future he'd described so many times you could see it. Somewhere the young couple who danced. Somewhere the families who chose to stay together, who who had gone down still holding the small hands they had sworn never to let go. Somewhere the Finnish grandmother. Somewhere, perhaps, the quiet man whose language you never learned, and whose name you never knew, and whose whole story ended that night in the cold, without anyone aboard ever understanding a word of it. The stars burned on. The sea went flat and black and calm again, calmer than before, as though nothing at all had happened, as though the greatest ship in the world had not just slid beneath it with 1,500 souls. The cold deepened, the night held its breath, and far off, over the curve of the dark sea, a light was coming. Too late for most, but coming. We will not stay in the water. No one should. Let us follow the light. The ship that came was the Carpathia, racing through the ice in the dark at a speed she was never built for, her captain driving her flat out toward a position he'd heard crackle through the wireless. Every spare blanket and pot of coffee and kind hand aboard her made ready for survivors he prayed were still alive to save. She arrived in the grey first light of morning, into a sea dotted with lifeboats and strewn with the terrible debris of the night, and she began gently to gather in the living. There were not many from steerage. That is the quiet, devastating coda to the whole story. The boats that the Carpathia pulled alongside, one after another in the dawn, were filled mostly with the women and children of the upper decks, with the survivors the arithmetic had favoured. Here and there among them, a steerage woman with her children, saved by luck and a good steward and a fast climb. Here and there a steerage man, pulled half dead from the freezing water by a boat that had found its nerve. But mostly the poor were simply not there. They were in the sea, behind, below, gone. The survivors came up the Carpathia's side cold and stunned and silent. There is always in the accounts this silence, not screaming, not weeping, not at first, just a vast, hollow, disbelieving quiet, the silence of people whose world has ended and who have not yet found the words, may never find the words, for what they have just lived through. They were wrapped in blankets, they were given hot drinks, they were counted and named, and slowly, terribly, the counting revealed the size of it, as wife searched for husband and mother searched for son, and the searches again and again came up empty. The poor who survived had survived into a particular kind of horror. They had crossed the ocean to escape their old lives, and now their new lives began with the loss of everyone they'd brought along to share them. A woman saved with her babies, but not her husband, arriving in the promised land a widow with children and no money and no English. The dream curdled into nightmare in a single night. A child saved but orphaned, pulled from the sea into a future no one had planned. The survivors of steerage did not get a happy ending. They got the rest of their lives, which they had to live anyway, carrying the night with them, in a country that had not, after all, been the heaven they'd prayed for. The Carpathia turned and steamed for New York with her cargo of the rescued, and the world's wires lit up with the news, and by the time she reached the harbour, a harbour the poor had dreamed of for months at the price of everything they owned, there were crowds and reporters and a grief that spanned an ocean. The survivors came down the gangway into the flashbulbs and the chaos, the famous and the nameless together, and the nameless mostly stayed nameless. The poor mourned in lists and numbers while the rich were mourned by name. But they were real, every one of them. They had eaten the wonderful food and danced the wonderful dances and dreamed the wonderful dreams, and they had been, for 5 bright days, the luckiest poor people in the world, and then for 2.5 dark hours the unluckiest, and the only thing we can do for them now, more than a century on, lying warm and safe in our beds, is remember that they were here, and that they mattered, and that they should not have been the ones left at the bottom of the ship. Before we let the night go soft and slip towards sleep, let us spend one last quiet moment remembering not how they died but who they were, because they have spent more than 100 years being remembered chiefly as the people who drowned, and they deserve better than that. They were the brave ones. That is worth saying first and saying plainly. It takes a particular, enormous courage to do what they did, to sell everything, to gather up your children and your whole life and step onto a ship bound for a country you have never seen, where you know no one, speak nothing, and have nothing but the few coins sewn into your coat and a stubborn refusal to accept that this is all life will ever offer you. The poor on the Titanic were not victims who wandered into history. They were gamblers, dreamers, the boldest people their villages produced, the ones with the nerve to leave. The timid stayed home. These were the ones who dared. They were ordinary too, in the way that ordinary people are quietly extraordinary. They worried about money and laundry and seasick children. They flirted and gossiped and played cards and lost. They made friends across languages they couldn't speak. They prayed in a dozen tongues to a dozen gods. They were generous with their bread and quick with their opinions and devoted above all to the children who were the entire point of the journey, the small, running, shrieking reasons that any of them had got on the ship at all. They came from places that have mostly forgotten them, Irish villages emptying out year by year, Scandinavian farms with too many sons and not enough land, Lebanese hill towns, Bulgarian fields, Croatian coasts, the whole great human tide of the poor flowing west toward the rumour of something better. They carried their countries in their songs and their faiths in their hands, and they meant to plant all of it in American soil and watch it grow into something their grandchildren would barely recognise. Some of them made it. Let us not forget that either. Some of the poor survived and went on and built exactly the lives they'd crossed the ocean for, and had children and grandchildren who are walking around today, alive because a great-grandmother climbed fast enough through a maze in the dark. The dream was real. For some, it even came true. The tragedy is not that the dream was a lie. The tragedy is that so many who deserved it never got the chance to find out, and the ones who didn't make it left almost nothing behind. No grand memorials, mostly. No names in marble. A line in a passenger manifest. A space at a kitchen table back home that never filled again. A letter that was answered too late or never. They sank into the cold dark with their dreams still folded up inside them, and the sea does not keep records, and the world moved on, as the world always does. So this is their memorial, such as it is. A quiet voice in the dark, more than a century later, on the far side of every gate that ever divided them from the boats, saying simply this: "You were here, you were brave, you were loved, and you danced on the grandest ship in the world. We remember you. Rest now. You've earned it more than anyone. So here we are, you and I, at the end of the voyage and the quiet that comes after. Let the ship go now. Let it sink back down into the deep where it has rested for more than 100 years, far below the cold and the dark, far below anywhere the gates or the classes or the arithmetic can ever reach again, where first and third and second all lie together at last, in the same soft silence, equal in the end as they never were in life. Let the people go too, gently, the way you'd set down something fragile. The talkative Irishman with his cousin in Boston, the calm old woman in the corner bunk, the young couple who danced, the children who ran shrieking through the general room with all the joy in the world, who were going to grow up American and forget the old country, and who instead became the thing the old country could never forget. Let them rest. They are warm now, somewhere, in whatever heaven they prayed toward in a dozen languages, and they do not need us to grieve them tonight. They only need us to remember that they were here, and you can let go of the day now too, whatever it held, whatever you carried into this dark with you. It can wait until morning, like the laundry always could, like everything always can. There is no ocean to cross tonight. There is no ticket sewn into your coat, no inspector waiting, no head count to do, no money to lie awake adding up in the dark. There is just your own bed, which is yours, and warm and dry and going nowhere at all. If anything tonight has eased you towards sleep, you might quietly share it with someone you know who lies awake too, who stares at the ceiling the way you sometimes do, who could use a soft voice and a long, slow story to carry them under, but only if you'd like to. There's no rush. There's never any rush here. Feel the weight of the blanket. Feel how still the floor is, how it does not rise and fall, how it simply holds you, steady and certain. Listen, if you like, for the hum, that deep, gentle engine hum that rocked them all to sleep, the steady heartbeat of the great ship carrying everyone safely on through the dark toward a morning that, for most of them, never came. But it will come for you. The morning always comes for you. You have nothing to cross to reach it but a few easy hours of sleep. Your breathing is slowing now. That's right. That's just right. Let each breath out a little longer than the last. Let your shoulders go soft. Let the cabin of your mind go dim and quiet. The lamps turned low, the village settling, the snoring beginning somewhere far away and not bothering you at all. There is nowhere you have to be. There is nothing you have to do. The voyage is over, and you are safe, and you are warm, and you are exactly where you are meant to be, which is here, drifting, unhurried, going slowly and softly and sweetly down into the deep, kind dark of sleep. Good night, traveller. Rest easy. Sleep well. I'll be here when you wake.